Hi, my name is Nadia Bakhtiari, and I'm an immigration lawyer at Esna Law Professional Corporation in Toronto, Ontario. As a Canadian immigration lawyer, I focus a lot of my practice on permanent residency and in particular sponsorship. For today's video, I want to talk a little bit about sponsorship, go through the process, the different types of sponsorships, as well as the commonly asked questions that I get a lot in consultations. And I really want to break a lot of the myths that you might see or hear about online. So let's just jump into it. I'm going to be focusing on spousal, common law, and conjugal sponsorships. So this is partner sponsorships. And partner sponsorships are broken down into three categories. Most commonly, you see spousal sponsorship. What does spousal sponsorship mean? It means that you are legally married to someone and that marriage is going to be recognized inside of Canada. So if your marriage is only recognized and legal in the country outside of Canada, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It needs to be recognizable in Canada. Just as an example, if you have another marriage, but you're still in a marriage from a previous relationship, then that would not qualify in Canada to be counted as a valid marriage because you can only be married to one person at a time. So you'd need to be legally divorced from your previous partner before you could get married. So a spousal sponsorship, like I said, is probably the most common thing that you see or hear about online when it comes to partner sponsorships. The second one is called common law sponsorship. Now, common law sponsorship is actually kind of interesting because not a lot of Western countries even have common law sponsorship like the United States. Common law sponsorship is actually quite simple to obtain, and a lot of people are surprised by this. The reason for that is because common law definition in Canada is 1 year of continuous cohabitation. So before, common law in Ontario at least had a definition of something like 3 years, and it was not that simple to get the common law status be given to you and your partner. In immigration, it's much more simple. It's 1 year continuous. So continuous, what does that mean? No large breaks. If your partner, went home to visit their family for a month, that's not a real time apart. That's just a small little break or a vacation. Another example is if someone goes to finish a semester abroad, then that's also temporary in nature. So you might want to do a check with a legal professional to see if you meet that 1 year of continuous cohabitation, if you have those little breaks, but generally it is quite flexible as long as you can show permanent establishment for 1 year cohabitating together. The third is conjugal. So conjugal sponsorship, we don't actually see that often because it is meant to cover more unique cases. But conjugal basically means that you act like a spouse between you and your partner, but for some reason you can't get that legal certification. So just give you an example, I think the most common things that we see are same-sex couples. So if you are from a country where, actually, I think I'll give an example. It's probably the easiest way to do it. I'm from Canada. My partner is in a country that doesn't recognize same-sex marriage, let's say the Philippines. My partner has tried to get a visa to come to Canada, but it's been denied. So we can't get married here. And I can't go and visit her in the Philippines where we could get married because same-sex marriage is not recognized there. So what do? We got to submit a conjugal sponsorship because we are acting like spouses. We are in a relationship like we are spouses, but we can't legally provide that marriage certificate. So that's when conjugal comes into play. There's a couple other examples I could give for conjugal, but honestly, it's a little bit open-ended, and it's open-ended for a reason because people's situations are different, but generally it's for when barriers, physical or legal, are present that do not allow a couple to be legally married even though they act like legally married spouses. Okay, so let's break that down. Common law, spousal, conjugal. All three of these processes are very similar in terms of their documentation, somewhat similar in their processing time, and generally IRCC is looking for almost the same thing for the three of them. Common law and spousal are nearly identical. Conjugal, a little bit different. Now, the reason why I said almost identical is because conjugal arguably does have a higher processing time just because there are a little bit more barriers. Like it's hard to prove that you have a relationship like spouses if you're not able to live together or get married. So just keep that in mind as I'm going through it. Conjugal is a little bit of like, put a little asterisk next to it because it's not as similar as common law and spousal. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of spousal and common law applications. So there's inside of Canada, outside of Canada, and then a third option, which is actually an outside of Canada application, but you're inside of Canada. And I'll break that down in a second. So inside of Canada, pretty straightforward. The sponsor, the Canadian PR or Canadian citizen, is inside of Canada, and the applicant is inside of Canada. The second one is outside can be that I am the sponsor and I live in Canada, but my partner lives outside, or we both live outside. The third option is outside but inside, which basically means you're submitting an outside of Canada sponsorship, but you're both inside of Canada. Now, why that's a little bit confusing is because it's actually reserved for specific scenarios. Let's say, I gotta give examples with everything, but let's say that I entered Canada with a fake passport and a fake identity. The regulations for an inside of Canada sponsorship, I think it's the policies actually, say that I'm not eligible to apply for an inside of Canada sponsorship because of the way I entered the country with a fake passport and fake identity. So because of that, I have to submit an outside of Canada application, but I'm not necessarily outside of Canada. Now, where you see this on the document checklist that you fill out for your IRCC application, you're going to see 3 options there. And that's that third option that you'll see on the document checklist. One more thing about the outside but inside application is that for inside of Canada applications, you cannot submit an appeal to the Immigration Appeal Division if your application is refused. You can for outside. So for some people, they want to submit an outside of Canada application when they're inside because they want to have the ability to get to the Immigration Appeal Division, because that's where you can argue humanitarian and compassionate grounds considerations if your application is refused. So I don't want to go too much into it. I just want you guys to know that there is that third option, and why that third option is present. It's not very common, but it is a potential third option if for some reason you don't qualify for inside. All right, so let's talk about what goes inside of an application between inside and outside. And again, we're focusing on spousal and common law. I'll talk about conjugal a little bit as well. So what goes inside of an application? The document checklist with IRCC is quite straightforward. It tells you exactly what you need. So from the applicant, it'll have a little list of what you need. From the sponsor, it'll have a little list of what you need. And then as a couple, it'll have a list of what you need. There are differences between, as a couple, what you need for inside versus outside. So let's talk about spousal sponsorship from inside of Canada. Some of the things you're going to need is your proof of cohabitation documents. Do you guys live together in Canada? If not, why don't you live together? You're both in Canada. There's got to be an explanation. If you're outside of Canada, you don't need those cohabitation documents for a spousal. Instead, what you need is proof of visiting each other, proof of communication. So if my partner lives in Turkey, have I ever flown to see my partner? Has my partner ever flown to see me? How often do we see each other? Can I provide screenshots that show that we talk on WhatsApp every day? So you don't need to do that for an inside, but you do need to do that for an outside. Now, conjugal, because all conjugal applications are technically outside of Canada, the documentation that you need to focus on for a conjugal application will really come down to genuineness and proving that you guys are in a relationship like spouses. So conjugal does require a little bit more documentation and focus on proof of communication, proof of staying in touch, proof of treating each other like spouses, proof of financial support. Those things are important for conjugal. Common law. One of the common law things that are prevalent for both inside and outside in terms of documentation is cohabitation. So do you have the documentation to prove your common law? And if not, let's get an explanation in there. You know, how can you submit a common law application, but you don't have enough documentation to prove you've been living together? It happens, but you need to be extra careful with that. All right, what do officers look for in sponsorship applications? When I talk to clients, I say that there are 2 different parts to sponsorship that officers look for. 1 is admissibility, 2 is genuineness. So let's talk about admissibility because it's sponsor admissibility, applicant admissibility. Sponsor admissibility is pretty straightforward. Are you bankrupt? Have you ever declared bankruptcy? No, move on. Have you ever been charged with domestic violence? No, move on. Do you owe any financial assistance? Are you receiving any financial assistance? No, move on. Now let's talk about the applicant admissibility. Are you criminally inadmissible to Canada? Are you medically inadmissible to Canada? Those are the two things that they're really looking for. And if you are criminally inadmissible, then you can take a look at criminal rehab applications. If you're not eligible for criminal rehab, then you can throw in humanitarian and compassionate considerations, if you have some, for both your criminal inadmissibility and your medical inadmissibility. But I mean, I'm trying to give a generalization here. If you do have these inadmissibility concerns as the applicant, talk to a lawyer about it, because you're going to go through the humanitarian and compassionate considerations together and see how to really present that argument. So that's the admissibility portion. That's what the officer is looking for. The second part is genuineness. Genuineness is honestly probably what I get asked about the most. How do you prove that you're a genuine couple? And in my opinion, it's easier than a lot of people think. So if you are in a genuine relationship, your documentation, your reference letters, the things that IRCC requires really speaks for itself. You know, you often speak to each other, you often see each other, your family does know about each other, you post each other on social media, you have photos together. Those things should come naturally to you. If for whatever reason you don't have those things because, I don't know, maybe your partner's family doesn't accept you, or maybe financial concerns have constrained you guys from seeing each other very often, so you don't get to see each other a lot, you really got to overcompensate at that point if you have something missing in your relationship, and be conscious of that, because genuineness is arguably one of the most important things for sponsorship applications. So coming back to the question, how do you prove it? Use the IRCC guideline on documents, but if you have something missing, add supporting documents. So I'm going to try to think of an example. If I don't have trips to go see my partner who lives in Turkey, what do I have? I have a lot of proof of shared financial expenses. I have a lot of proof of us talking to each other constantly, because that's not costly. I have proof of my partner sending me gifts and me sending them gifts. I have proof of screenshots of my mom FaceTiming my partner and talking to them as often as possible. So you want to try to overcompensate if there's something you don't have to prove genuineness of documentation through documentation. All right, another really common question I get, kind of related to this, is, will our marriage look sketchy? And I get this question in various forms, because they'll say, does my marriage look sketchy because this? Does my marriage look sketchy because of this? So for example, does my marriage look sketchy because I'm having a city hall wedding and my parents can't come? Does my marriage look sketchy because we want to move to Canada, and one of the reasons why we're submitting this application is just, you know, to relocate our family there? The answer is obviously it depends, but most of the time, no. That's not the assessment IRCC is making. They don't have this one question here being like, was your wedding elaborate enough for us to decide if your application should be approved? That's not what this is based off of. So when you ask yourself, does my marriage look sketchy, and you have those follow-up questions, you got to think, what was the circumstance? Can you explain it? For example, I didn't have an elaborate wedding and I'm submitting an application to sponsor my partner because I don't have the money to do that right now. And next year, me and my partner have a plan to have a much nicer wedding with my family when the PR is approved in our home country together. Or I'm submitting this application because I have a job offer inside of Canada and I want to move our family there and I don't want to break apart from my partner, so we're going to be submitting a sponsorship. None of that is sketchy. That's the reality of relationships. So you just got to make sure you explain if there is something that you have a little bit of a shortcoming on, like a small wedding or a need to move to Canada that you might not have necessarily needed before, but definitely not sketchy. Just explain yourself. Okay, let's talk about processing times and stages, because again, I think this is one of the most common questions that I get. So in terms of processing time, I'm going to break it down in stages. So this is applicable, I think, to actually all three: conjugal, common law, and spousal. So the first thing you're going to get when you submit your application is an AOR. It's basically like the application number will almost always start with an F, and that's supposed to show family class sponsorship application. When you get this AOR, that's when your processing time starts. It doesn't start from the time you submit the application. It's from the time you get that AOR. So AOR is the first thing. The second thing is most likely your biometrics request for the applicant. So if you've already done biometrics on a temporary residence application, you're probably going to need to do it again because permanent residency has its own biometrics. So the applicant's going to do their biometrics. That process from the time, oh, actually, let me backtrack. Your AOR is going to get, for inside of Canada, about 4 to 8 weeks. For outside of Canada, can be about 3 to 4 months. Biometrics after that generally can come about 2 to 3 months after your AOR. Sometimes it comes immediately, but budget for about 2 to 3 months after. You will also get the sponsor approval, which is also called first stage approval letter, generally in under 6 months from submission of the application, maybe a couple months after the AOR comes in. And that applies again for common law, spousal, conjugal, inside or outside. Next will likely be the medical examination request for the applicant to do. And that again is probably at the maybe 8-month mark from the AOR. If it's an inside of Canada application, it could be a little bit faster. It can even come with your biometrics. So now you're looking about 8 months in, you have your medical exam, you have first stage approval, you have biometrics done, you have your AOR. Once the medical is done, then they go into processing the eligibility of the applicant. Now the eligibility of the applicant usually includes an assessment on the relationship as well. And this part can slow down. Depends on how straightforward your application is. If you've got a straightforward application, you've got everything that they're looking for, you're inside of Canada, you've been married for a couple of years, you have kids together, all that stuff, you're gonna breeze right through it. If you have a little bit of concern, it might hold you back. So in terms of the timeline until you get to that eligibility applicant approval, for straightforward applications can be about 8 months. For more complex ones can be about 12 months. Once you get the applicant eligibility letter, IRCC will likely send you a pre-arrival services letter, and from there, the final PR issuance. That pre-arrival services and final PR issuance process, it really depends because that's also when they do your security clearance. So for some people, I've seen that take 3 weeks, and for other people, I've seen that take 6 months. I can't really speak generally because everyone's situation is really different about what happened in that last stretch. But I would say overall, inside of Canada sponsorship, for straightforward applications, you're looking at about 8 months. For outside of Canada sponsorship, it really depends on the visa office. So for example, Americans, a lot faster, I would say about a year, less than a year. For Asian and African countries, you're looking at about a year and a half. If you're lucky, you're also in the 1-year category. So that's basically the way to look at the stages and the processing times. The last thing I'll say about processing times is conjugal. So like I said, the stages are the same for conjugal, but processing time in terms of proving genuineness, that eligibility portion, might take a little bit longer. So I would say conjugal, always budget for about a year and a half, I think, to be safe. Okay? Now another question I get a lot, am I gonna have an interview? It depends. So interviews are very common for applicants who do not necessarily have a long-standing relationship. So if you've met your partner online and you live in foreign countries, you have different cultures, you have age gaps, you might not speak the same language, you might have only been together for about a year, you got married after the first or second time you saw each other, yeah, you're probably going to have an interview. So if you think you might have an interview, you probably will have an interview. I think that's really the general threshold to see if you're going to have one, because what they're looking for is to prove you're in a real relationship. Now, for an interview, you got to be well prepared for it. I think a lot of people go into interviews thinking it's going to be easy, but it absolutely is not. If an officer is calling you in for an interview, they have concerns, and this is your chance to satisfy their concerns. The questions they ask are unique and bizarre, and they really are tailored to couples who know each other well. So an example, I saw a case once where the officer's questions were, how many bedrooms does your partner's house have? What's the color of your partner's house? What is their elementary school? What's their zodiac sign? Like things that you kind of know from being on FaceTime with your partner for a while. Not generic things like, tell me about your first date, because those are easy. You kind of make that up and then, you move on. But an officer is really looking for these kind of bizarre little questions to see if you know. So definitely get the proper attention and almost training that you need before you have these interviews. If you have a straightforward application and you're both inside of Canada, you probably won't have an interview. All right, just 2 more things to talk about. The first thing is work permits. So this was a somewhat recent change, probably in the last year, maybe year and a half, Work permits were open work permits were always part of the inside of Canada sponsorship application. So what that means is I submit an inside of Canada permanent residency application, and then once you get the application number or proof of confirmation of submission of the PR, you can submit that open work permit right after. New rule is that outside of Canada sponsorships can also do this once the applicant is inside of Canada. So what that means, if I'm an American citizen and my partner is Canadian, we submit this application while I'm outside. Halfway through the process, I come to Canada and I decide I'm just going to stay here until the PR is done. I can do that. I can ask for an open work permit even though my application was submitted outside, but now I'm physically inside of Canada. So that's a new rule. It's really great. Just be patient on the open work permits. I have very often seen PR applications actually be approved before the open work permits. So just be conscious of that. Processing times are all over the place. I really hesitate telling you anything because I've seen 1 month and I've seen 8 months, no answer, PR gets approved. All right, last thing, difference in landing. So you've gone through all of this and now your PR application is basically done. What does done look like now? So inside versus outside has different processes. Inside, super easy process. IRCC will send you an email that says, congratulations, your PR has been approved. Set up a PR portal. So this PR portal is how you're going to be doing your landing. And it's going to ask you a couple questions. You know, your address, your name. It's going to ask you to upload photos again. And then you're going to have to wait until they download the confirmation of PR. E-co-PR is what it's called, into your portal. Unfortunately, as of end of 24, as of 25, this e-co-PR can take 60 days or more. So be patient with that to come into your portal. But if it's been more than 60 days, call IRCC and flag it to them that your e-co-PR is not yet in your portal. Once you get your e-co-PR, you've officially landed in Canada. When your application is approved and until you get your e-co-PR, you are not officially a permanent resident. So be very conscious of that. And I highly recommend not moving until your e-co-PR comes in. So a lot of people will submit an application from inside of Canada and then go on a trip and then come back. But while they were on their trip, their e-co-PR came in. This is problematic because you have to land from inside of Canada. So definitely be very conscious of that. And once your PR is approved, try to stay put until that e-co-PR comes into your portal. Now, the second way to land is for outside of Canada applicants. So if you are visa exempt, like the United States applicants, then you don't need a PR visa. You just need to physically arrive inside of Canada and you will be issued your confirmation of PR document, generally by Canada Border Services at the port of entry. You just let them know you're here to do your landing. IRCC will send you all the instructions and you're good to go. If you are not visa exempt, as in you require visa to come to Canada, IRCC is going to send you a passport request. You're going to have to mail your passport to a VFS office and they're going to put a PR visa in your passport. Just like the eco-PR process, you are not a PR just because you got a PR visa on your passport. You've got to physically come to Canada, physically land at the border, and then you are a permanent resident because Canada Border Services has to land you from your PR visa and give you that co-PR at the border. So that's generally the process from beginning to end. My general remarks are, I get a lot of people asking me if they should apply for sponsorship or go through a different route. If you are in a stable, happy, healthy relationship where there's no power imbalance, sponsorship is a great way to go. It's fast, it's straightforward, it's not that discretionary. Generally, if you have a genuine application and you're both admissible, it should be fine. But of course, every case is different. Just something to keep in mind, I'm a big fan of sponsorship for people who are in good relationships and have this avenue available to them. Inside of Canada, in my experience, is faster. And I say this because I see a lot of information out there that says outside of Canada is faster. I don't really know why. I know IRCC changes their processing times all the time, but in my opinion, inside of Canada is more straightforward, it's easy, it's faster. So that's generally the overview. I think the only other thing I would like to say, because I get this a lot, is to be very conscious about coming to Canada to submit a PR application. I can't go through all of it right now, but I would really recommend if you have plans to come to Canada and you've got a U-Haul full of all your stuff and you plan on telling the land border at the Canadian port of entry, hey, I'm here, I want to move to Canada and I'm going to submit my PR application, that's not going to fly. So make sure you get a lawyer to talk to, because we will be able to guide you a little bit on the best way to move to Canada as a visitor while still knowing and being respectful of the conditions of your temporary stay as a visitor, because you do have the ability to come in and later submit a permanent resident application, but you got to be really careful when you're dealing with Canada Border Services doing that, because they don't want anybody coming in as visitors and not being genuine visitors. So we'll definitely guide you, we'll keep you informed, all of that. Make sure you're following all the conditions and regulations of temporary residency, and just ensure that you're going through the sponsorship process properly. So feel free to contact us if you have any questions about your sponsorship. I hope this was helpful and giving you a little bit of guidance on what the sponsorship process looks like in 25. If you have any questions, feel free to contact our office and book a consultation with any of our lawyers.